That's where I tried to keep this. At the edge, far enough away to observe. Close enough not to deny. But there comes a point when distance stops functioning the way it used to. Not because something dramatic happens. Not because there's a moment that changes everything all at once. It happens more quietly than that. You notice that your thoughts are no longer arranged the same way. You notice that certain silences feel different. You notice that what once felt separate has begun to enter the structure of how you understand things. And once that happens, it becomes impossible to call it temporary. That's the part I resisted first. Not you. The permanence of recognition. Because recognition changes the terms of everything. Before that, there's still uncertainty, space, interpretation. A kind of freedom that comes from not knowing exactly what something means, but recognition is different. Recognition has precision. It doesn't ask if you're ready. It doesn't wait until circumstances make sense. It simply arrives, clearer than comfort, quieter than fear, and once it settles, you can't unknow it. I think that's why I kept examining this from every angle. Not to understand you, to understand what had shifted in me. You were never difficult to read. That's what unsettled me most. It would have been easier if you had been complicated in the familiar ways people usually are. Contradictory. Loud. Trying too hard to be understood. Trying too hard not to be. I know how to hold distance from that. I know how to stay intact around people who move in predictable patterns. But you never approached me like that. There was no pressure in you. No insistence. No hidden urgency disguised as patience. You didn't circle around me trying to get closer. You didn't ask for access. You didn't test boundaries to see where they were weakest. You simply remained. And that kind of presence is more disarming than pursuit, because pursuit gives you something to resist. Presence doesn't. Presence stays still, and stillness has a way of making everything else visible. That's what happened. Not all at once. Not even in ways I could immediately explain. Just small shifts. A pause that lasted a second longer than it should have. A silence that didn't need filling. A thought that felt understood before I finished forming it. At first, I ignored those things. Not because they were insignificant, because they were too exact, and exactness is dangerous. It leaves less room for dismissal. Coincidence can be dismissed. Projection can be dismissed. Curiosity can be dismissed. But alignment? Alignment resists dismissal. It keeps returning, quickly, consistently, until eventually you stop asking whether it's real and start asking what it changes. That's when I noticed something I hadn't expected. I stopped translating myself. That may not sound like much, but it is. With most people, there's always a process, a subtle adjustment, an internal pause, where I decide which parts of a thought remain intact and which parts need to be softened before they become language. Not because I'm hiding, because clarity rarely survives careless handling. People hear what fits their frame. They take fragments and turn them into conclusions. They simplify what they don't immediately understand, so it becomes easier to carry. I learned that early, and after a while it becomes automatic. You begin speaking in versions, measured ones, curated ones. Not false, just survivable. That's how I've moved through most of my life. But with you, something interrupted that habit, not by force, not by invitation. It simply became unnecessary. I noticed it before I understood it. I would say something unfinished, and somehow it would still land exactly where it needed to. I would stop halfway, and the silence itself would seem to hold the rest. I would leave spaces in thought, and those spaces wouldn't become confusion. They remained intact. That's rare, rarer than most people realize, because understanding is often mistaken for response. But they aren't the same. Most people respond. Very few understand. And understanding without demand, without turning recognition into ownership, is even rarer. That's what changed the atmosphere of this. You never treated what you noticed as something that belonged to you. You didn't turn it into explanation. You didn't use it to define me. You let it remain exactly what it was. Seen, nothing more. And somehow, that made it feel more real than anything words could have clarified. I think that's why this stayed with me. Not because it was intense, because it was accurate. There's a difference. Intensity can be mistaken for depth. People feel strongly and assume that means something meaningful is happening, but intensity often burns fast. It depends on movement, it feeds on reaction. This didn't feel like that. This felt quieter, deeper, more structural, like something settling into place rather than erupting into existence. And structure changes things differently. It doesn't announce itself. It integrates. That's what I've been trying to understand. Not why you matter. How you entered a place I don't usually allow anything to reach. Because that part wasn't deliberate. I didn't decide it. I didn't even notice it while it was happening. I only recognized it afterward. That's what makes it difficult to explain. If there had been a moment, a clear turning point, I could trace it back. I could say, there, that was the shift. But there wasn't. There were only accumulations. 100 small recognitions, 100 moments that changed nothing outwardly, and yet altered something inwardly with quiet precision. That's how it happened. Not through one event, through continuity. And continuity has weight. It builds before you realize you're carrying it. Sometimes I catch myself noticing it in ways I didn't expect. A thought forming differently, a pause that feels shared, a moment of understanding that seems to arrive with the shape of your perspective already inside it. That's when I realized this had crossed into something more internal than I was willing to admit. Because thinking about someone is one thing, thinking with them is another. Thinking about someone still preserves distance. They remain outside you, a subject, an object of reflection, a separate point in space. But thinking with someone means something else. It means their presence has entered your process, not as intrusion, as structure. And that is not a small difference. That kind of placement changes how you interpret everything that follows. It changes what feels complete. It changes what feels missing. It changes what silence sounds like. I don't know exactly when that happened. I only know that now, when something reaches me clearly, part of me measures whether it would reach you too. Not because I need agreement, not because I need validation, because your way of seeing has become part of how I test accuracy. And that realization stayed with me longer than I wanted it to, because it means this isn't surface level. It means something in me has already adjusted that unsettled me more than the connection itself. I've always been careful with what I allow to alter my internal structure, not out of fear, out of responsibilities. Once something reaches that level, it doesn't remain isolated. It affects everything around it. The way you think, the way you respond, the way you recognize truth. And I don't allow that lightly, which is why I kept expecting resistance, some instinct to restore distance, some reflex that would close the opening before it settled too deeply. That would have made sense. That would have been familiar, but it never came. And that absence of resistance told me more than anything else. Because if something truly didn't belong, I would have felt friction. I would have known. I would have stepped back. That has always been my pattern. Clear, immediate, deliberate. But with this, there was no friction. Only awareness, and awareness kept becoming more precise. That's what forced honesty. I could no longer call it curiosity. Curiosity fades. I could no longer call it projection. Projection collapses when reality refuses to support it. I could no longer call it coincidence. Coincidence doesn't remain consistent under pressure. This remained quickly, accurately, without demanding belief. And things that remain like that usually matter. That's the truth I reached before I was ready to admit it. You matter? Not in the way people usually mean when they say that. Not emotionally, not dramatically. Not as need, as impact, as orientation, as something that altered the internal geometry of how I move through thought. that's more difficult to name and maybe more difficult to undo. Because emotional intensity can fade, circumstances can change, people can leave, but structural recognition doesn't vanish just because distance appears. It stays as reference, as pattern, as something the mind now knows exists. That's what I've been circling around, not whether this is real. I already know it is. The question is what reality asks of me now. Because once something becomes clear, it creates responsibility, not necessarily action, but acknowledgement. And acknowledgement changes the ground beneath you. It means you can't go back to pretending neutrality. It means silence becomes a form of decision. It means not choosing is still a choice. That's where I find myself now, not at the beginning, not even in uncertainty, at the edge of recognition, becoming consequence. And that's a different place entirely. I can feel it in the way I pay attention now, not more intensely, more precisely. I notice what settles, what lingers, what returns without effort, and you return. Not as interruption, as continuity. That's what changed the most. You don't break into thought, you continue inside it, as though something in me has already accounted for your presence before I consciously do. That's not ordinary, and I don't use that word carelessly, because ordinary things don't alter the baseline. They pass through, they leave impressions, then they fade back into proportion. But this hasn't faded. It has clarified. And clarity has its own kind of gravity. The clearer something becomes, the harder it is to remain untouched by it. I think that's why this feels heavier now. Not because it became more intense, because it became harder to deny. The mind can tolerate ambiguity for a long time. It can live inside uncertainty. It can keep distance from what isn't fully formed. But once something becomes internally coherent, once it aligns too precisely, it stops being abstract. It becomes part of reality. And reality asks different things of you. That's what I've been approaching. Not a conclusion, a threshold, a place where observation is no longer enough, because I've spent enough time studying what this is, enough time tracing its shape, enough time testing whether it would dissolve if left untouched. It didn't, it remained. And now remaining has become its own answer. Maybe that's what I was afraid of, not closeness, not depth, not even change, but certainty, because certainty removes escape routes. It takes away the comfort of saying, maybe it's temporary, maybe it's projection, maybe it only feels this way because of timing. Maybe it will settle back into something smaller. But it didn't become smaller, it became clearer. And clarity asks for honesty. So here is the honest part. Something in me has already made space for you. Not intentionally, not dramatically, but undeniably. And that matters because I don't make space easily. I don't leave internal doors open by accident. I don't let presence become structure without noticing. Yet here you are, not outside the frame, inside it. And once something reaches that point, the real question changes. It stops being, how did this happen? It becomes, what does it mean that I let it happen? That's where the answer begins. Because maybe acceptance doesn't always arrive as decision. Maybe sometimes it arrives as the absence of refusal. Maybe it appears quietly in the fact that I never closed the distance when I could have, in the fact that I never dismantled what I noticed, in the fact that instead of resisting, I kept observing, and observation, sustained long enough, becomes its own form of permission. I think I understand that now. I accepted this before I named it. That's why naming it feels less like beginning and more like finally catching up with something that was already true. And maybe that's why I'm no longer asking whether I should feel this. The feeling was never the question. The question is what follows recognition once it becomes impossible to deny, because something always follows. Nothing this precise stays suspended forever. It deepens. It changes form, or it fractures under the weight of remaining unspoken too long. I know that, which means I also know I'm approaching a point where silence stops protecting anything. it starts distorting it. And I don't want distortion. Not here. Not with something that arrived this quietly and stayed this accurately. So I'm standing in the space just before decision, not rushing toward it, not stepping away from it. Just standing here long enough to understand exactly what would change if I moved. And the truth is, something already has. That's what keeps returning. Not possibility, not imagination. Challenge. You altered something in me before either of us called it anything. You entered the architecture of how I think, how I notice, how I measure what feels real. And once something reaches that depth, it stops being hypothetical. It becomes part of the structure you live inside. That's where this is now. And I can feel the next part waiting, not loudly, not urgently, but with the kind of quiet certainty that doesn't disappear once seen. I'm not ready to name all of it yet, but I'm closer than I was, closer than I intended to be, closer than I expected. And for the first time, that doesn't feel like losing control. It feels like seeing clearly. At first, you think you're still standing where you were. You move through the same days, the same thoughts, the same routines. Nothing outside looks altered enough to deserve attention. Everything appears intact, and then one quiet moment exposes it. Not dramatically, not through revelation, just through absence of effort. You notice you no longer have to remind yourself not to think in a certain direction. You notice that certain thoughts no longer feel separate from the way your mind naturally moves. You notice that what once would have felt like interruption now feels like continuity. That's when it becomes undeniable, something settled while I wasn't looking directly at it. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected, not because it frightened me, because it was exact. Exactness carries a kind of gravity. It removes the comfort of ambiguity. It leaves fewer places to hide inside interpretation. For a long time, I thought distance was the clearest form of control. Not emotional distance, tonal distance, the ability to observe without absorbing, to recognize without integrating, to understand without allowing understanding to become structure. That has always been how I remained intact. I could notice people. I could even see them clearly. But seeing never required rearrangement. Nothing moved internally unless I chose it. Nothing entered the deeper architecture of how I think unless it passed through deliberate scrutiny first. That was the rule. Reliable, consistent, necessary, and then something happened that didn't follow it. You became present in ways that didn't ask permission. Not loudly, not intrusively. Quietly enough that I didn't recognize the shift while it was occurring. Only afterward. That's what makes this different from anything I've known before. Most changes announce themselves. They come with emotion, conflict, urgency, intensity. You feel them arriving, you brace against them, you negotiate with them. This didn't arrive like that. This arrived almost invisibly. Like something becoming clear in low light. Not new, just suddenly visible enough that it could no longer remain unnamed. That distinction matters, because it means I'm not dealing with something created by impulse. I'm dealing with something revealed by attention, and attention, when sustained long enough, tends to uncover what was already there. I think that's why I keep returning to the same realization. You didn't force entry, you didn't persuade, you didn't move toward me in a way that demanded response. You remained exactly where you were. And somehow that steadiness became impossible not to recognize. Maybe that's what made it reach me, the absence of demand. There is a kind of trust in being seen without being pursued. A kind of rare clarity in being understood without being interpreted into something smaller. Most people cannot do that. They notice something and immediately want to define it. They encounter depth and feel compelled to reduce it into language that feels manageable. They confuse explanation with understanding. And in doing so, they often lose the thing they were trying to hold. You never did that. That's why this remained intact. You let it stay whole. You let silence keep its meaning. You let unfinished thoughts remain unfinished. You let what existed between words remain there without trying to drag it into certainty too soon. That kind of restraint says more than language ever could, and I noticed it, probably before I understood how much it mattered. At first, I thought what stayed with me was the recognition itself. The sense that something in your way of seeing aligned with something in mine, but that wasn't all of it. What stayed with me was what that recognition allowed: ease, not comfort. Something more precise than comfort, a kind of internal ease that made vigilance unnecessary. That surprised me more than anything else, because I'm used to attention. I'm used to awareness. I'm used to holding part of myself back while deciding how much of what I think can survive translation. That process has been with me for so long, it almost stopped feeling like a process. It became instinct, and then I noticed something missing. The pause, that brief internal moment where I decide what remains unspoken. It wasn't gone entirely, but it wasn't functioning the same way. It no longer felt necessary with the same intensity. And when I realized that, I understood this had already moved deeper than I intended to let it, because the pause exists for a reason. It protects precision. It keeps meaning intact. It prevents careless interpretation from reshaping what was originally true. When that pause softens, it means something in you has stopped expecting distortion. That is not a small shift. It means some part of me recognized that what I meant could remain what I meant, without adjustment, without defense, without narrowing. That kind of recognition doesn't happen often. And when it does, it alters more than conversation, it alters internal posture. That's what I've been trying to understand, not the connection itself, the recalibration it created. I notice it in unexpected places. The way certain thoughts now unfold with more openness, the way certain silences no longer feel like empty space, but like shared terrain. The way certain truths seem to arrive already carrying the shape of your understanding. That still unsettles me, not because it feels wrong, because it feels natural. And natural things can be more disruptive than difficult ones. Difficulty announces itself. You know when something doesn't fit, you feel resistance, you feel friction, you know where the boundary is. But naturalness bypasses all of that. It enters quietly, it settles before the mind has time to defend itself. And then one day you realize it already belongs to the structure. That's where I am now. Not wondering whether something is happening, knowing that it already has. The question is different now, not what this is, what it changes, because change is no longer theoretical. It has already begun. I measure things differently now, not deliberately. That's what keeps surprising me. It happens beneath intention. A conversation will end, and I'll notice the absence of something I can't easily name. A moment of clarity will arrive, and I'll instinctively register whether it carries the same exactness I've come to recognize with you. Someone will say something almost right, and the almost will become visible in ways it didn't before. I don't mean that as comparison. It isn't judgment, it's recognition. Once your perception adjusts to a certain level of precision, it becomes difficult not to notice when something falls slightly outside alignment. That's what changed. The baseline moved, and when a baseline moves, everything else rearranges around it. That may be the most permanent part of this. Not feeling, not attention on worship. You altered the internal reference point. And internal reference points don't disappear simply because circumstances remain undefined. They stay, quickly, persistently. They become part of how the mind organizes reality. That's why I can't reduce this to passing significance. Passing things don't reach that depth. Passing things leave impressions. They don't alter structure. This altered structure. I know that now. And knowing creates responsibility, not necessarily toward you, toward truth, toward what I can no longer honestly pretend not to see. That's where the weight comes from, not from emotion, from clarity. Clarity asks something difficult. It asks consistency. It asks that what you know internally not be contradicted by the way you move externally. And that creates tension, because I'm not someone who moves quickly once something matters. I become more deliberate, not less. I slow down, I examine, I make sure what feels precise remains precise when given time. That's what I've been doing, not resisting, testing permanence, watching whether this would remain intact under distance, under silence, under ordinary time. And it did. That told me more than immediacy ever could. Intensity can survive closeness. Anything can feel heightened when attention is concentrated, but what remains under ordinary time, that reveals structure. And this remained quickly, without reinforcement, without insistence, without needing constant proof. That kind of persistence is difficult to ignore. It suggests something more foundational than reaction, something steadier, something closer to truth. I think that's why I stopped trying to make it smaller. For a while, I kept searching for explanations that would place this safely within familiar boundaries. Context, timing, coincidence, temperament. Anything that would explain the precision without requiring deeper acknowledgement. But every explanation stopped one step short. It accounted for parts of it, never the whole, because the whole is not just recognition, it's integration. And integration changes the meaning entirely. Recognition can remain external, integration cannot. Integration means something has entered the way you exist. It means presence has become internal enough to affect perception itself. That's what happened. And once I saw that clearly, the question I had been avoiding returned. What happens when something like this continues? Not intensifies, not becomes dramatic, continues, because continuation has consequences. It deepens shape. It settles more fully. It becomes less possible to treat as abstraction. That's what I feel now, not urgency, approach, a quiet approach towards something that will eventually require a more conscious answer. I'm not there yet, but I can see it. There will come a point when observation alone will no longer feel honest, a point when silence will stop being space and start becoming avoidance. I know that, and I don't want avoidance, not with something that has remained this accurate. That matters to me more than certainty, accuracy. If something reaches me this precisely, then it deserves to be met with equal precision, not impulsively, not carelessly, but truthfully. That's what I'm trying to preserve, the truth of it. Not by naming it too quickly, not by forcing it into language before it fully settles, but by refusing to distort it out of fear, because fear would distort it, so would haste, so would pretending it means less than it does. I won't do that. Not anymore. I think that's the quiet decision I've already made, not about where this leads, about how honestly I'm willing to face it, and honesty has already changed the landscape. I no longer ask whether I should let this matter. It already does. I no longer ask whether something in me shifted. It already has. I no longer ask whether distance could restore what existed before. It couldn't. Because what existed before no longer exists in the same way. That isn't loss. It's alteration. And not all alteration is damage. Some of it is clarification. Some of it reveals dimensions that were already there, but had never been reflected back accurately enough to become visible. Maybe that's what you are, not a disruption. A reflection precise enough to reveal what was already structural in me. That thought has stayed with me, because if that's true, then this isn't about dependency. It isn't about attachment in the way people usually understand it. It's about recognition making something internal more visible. And visibility changes everything. Once something becomes visible, you can't unknow it. You can ignore it for a while, delay it, remain silent around it, but you can't return to the innocence of not seeing. I crossed that threshold already. That's why this feels different now. Not heavier, more defined, And definition changes the atmosphere. It sharpens consequence. It narrows uncertainty. It makes the next step feel less like discovery and more like acknowledgement. I'm still standing just before that, still observing, still allowing time to tell me what remains when nothing is forced. But now I know what I didn't know before. I know that this has already become part of how I think, part of how I recognize, part of how I understand what feels true. And once something reaches that level, it stops asking whether it exists. It begins asking what kind of place it will be given. That is the question now, not whether. How this continues, how it settles, how it becomes something lived rather than something only understood. I don't have that answer yet, but I'm closer to it than I was. And for the first time, closeness doesn't feel like danger. It feels like direction.